We'll now begin our fifth and final session for today, the panel discussion, which will be led by our moderator, Mr. Aaron Maniam, the Director of Industry at the Ministry of Trade and Industry. So I'll now hand over the mic to Aaron.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Can everyone hear? Does this work? Okay, fantastic. First of all, I'm glad so many of us have stayed. This is actually quite impressive for a conference to have this many at the end of the first day. Usually jet lag and work will set in for the locals, and then you find that there's a huge dwindling. So this is fantastic, and I'm glad you're all here because we've heard 4 individual presentations, and each of them I think has layered on top of the previous ones. I'm hoping now that we can actually start exploring, in the spirit of complexity science, the interactions and connections amongst the different presentations. And I suspect there will be plenty of wealth and wonderful information that we end up discovering. Some of you might be wondering what civil servant who works in the government is doing moderating a panel like this. The main reason is that I can't say no to Jan, but also I'm a bit of a curious generalist, a person of practice, as he put it this morning. And I'm very keen on infusing complexity science and ideas of systems thinking into how we make policy, hopefully to do that better than we might have done before. Now, you've heard 4 really interesting presentations so far, right? And they've each touched on this idea of the gap or the difference and in some cases, the abyss or not between East and West. You've heard questions about whether there is such a thing as Eastern and Western thought, or are they labels that need to be disaggregated much further? And we saw some interesting responses to this question of the East-West difference. I think Andrew told us that there is a gap. It's based on different antennae and different deep codes in each of those cultures, but it's a fuzzy gap, right? There are things about that gap that need to be examined in a lot more detail. And Tonio came up and told us that there is some difference there as well, but it's not an incommensurable difference, right? It's differences that are based on historical contingencies and contextual dependent factors. Then we heard from Alan that there is a difference, but it's not a difference that's attributable to any kind of platonic essence or any kind of incommensurable difference. And then we heard from Helena, who tells us that language does make a difference, although we don't know exactly what the limits of those differences might be. Now, what I've asked the panel to start us off with, just to get us going, is for each of them, we'll kind of work from the beginning again. I've asked Andrew, Tonio, and Alan to tell us how they would now change their presentation, having heard what came after them. Because there has been some evolution, and I hope at least some development in the thinking. So I've asked them to just share, very briefly, in 2 or 3 minutes or so, what their thoughts might be on how their presentation might evolve now that they've heard everything else for day 1. And then after that, we're going to open up to questions and thoughts from any of you. I just want to highlight one thing. Jan mentioned in the morning that he's got great hopes for the younger generation, right, and how much they can infuse these ideas and take them into the world that they will inherit. So I'm hoping that we will hear questions from some of the younger folks in the crowd as well. I did warn some of you about this, so this should not be a complete shock to all of you. So I'm just putting that out there. This is not to say no one else can ask any questions. We welcome all the questions that are out there, but I'd like to put a particular plug out to the younger folks. Okay? We'll take a few questions at a time and then see how we can respond to them as intelligently as possible. So let's start with Andrew. You started us off this morning with some thoughts on theories of change in particular. And I'm curious if that theory of change can now be applied to your presentation itself and how it might evolve, having heard everybody else.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I really learned a lot from my fellow panelists. I think I'm the amateur, they are the professionals. They specialize in these issues. And I thought that Tonio's presentation kind of followed very naturally from mine, because he raised something that I did not want to raise, maybe because it's just my preferences, which is the role of war in evolution of cultures and civilizations. And of course, he raised something which is very fundamental to Chinese culture, which is Bilingual. Right, that life is about both the civil and the military. And in this area, actually, I have done some studies in this. And I thought it might be very useful just to supplement Tonio's analysis. The fundamental problem in Chinese governance has always been 内环外庆 That means the domestic corruption and external aggression. Now, that is because the North is subject to massive invasion from the Huns. The nomads always invade when they get hungry, and this is due to climate change. It's very simple analysis. When the weather gets too cold, the North would come down south to hunt for food, and when the weather gets very good, like during the Han Wudi period, you amass a lot of resources to go and fight the North. But the problem is a very strategic one, which needs to be understood, which is that when you actually mobilize an army to fight the North, and it's a large frontier, you cannot finance it. The funding for this is huge. And that's why fiscal, Chinese strategic governance thinking cannot be divorced from its fiscal management, okay? Which is why it is multidimensional. Actually, Chinese thinking is true complexity thinking, all right? When you try to finance the army to go up north to defend, you face two fundamental problems. The first one is that when you finance it, the army could actually rebel against you, because if they can't win against the North, they can march back to Beijing or Nanjing or whatever and take over. So the emperor is always worried about the army, right? That's a fundamental issue. The second one is, whilst your attention is financing for the North and you need to tax the South, which has the food, the South can go into rebellion. And so that when your army is up north, your back is being killed. So the Chinese government faces both this and also climate change issues. So if one needs to understand China, you need to understand how that philosophy is driven by a continental economy facing not just the Wen and the Wu, the civil governance and the military governance, as well as the financing of it, which is fiscal and monetary policy, which is why it's a very total issue. I thought that Professor Chan and Helena's I went deeper into these philosophical issues, and I really learned quite a lot from both of them. So I won't comment on that.
That's fine.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew, for starting us off on that. And it does sound like what you described in terms of the North and the South is partly damned if you do and damned if you don't, right? So that is one of the central dilemmas, and with the unintended consequences that can come about from actions in either of those spheres. Tonio?
Just to say, I found all the talks very stimulating, and I learned a lot, and from very different perspectives. Often when we go to conferences as experts and academics, we're with all historians or all economists or whatever, and it's so nice to have these different perspectives. It's very refreshing, and it really makes your brain kind of start sparking. So I think I would change my talk in many different ways. But I think one of the things, just to say and keep it short, that kind of sparked my thought was when I was listening to Helena's talk. It occurred to me, when we do our work, you have to learn lots of different languages. When you're doing history, for example, I had to learn Dutch and French and Spanish and German and Chinese, of course. And when you learn a language, especially when you really get into it, I mean, you can feel your brain stretch. You can feel what Helena was talking about, where new possibilities start emerging. You can look at yourself in new ways when you have other ways of representing the world, which is why bilingualism is so important. So it occurred to me that, if our project is to increase understanding and develop new dialogues, I mean, the best thing we can do is encourage language learning. So bilingual, trilingual societies like Singapore, maybe that's one reason why there's so much going on here. And America, I think, needs a lot of help in this respect. Xi Jinping's daughter studied at Harvard. We need to have the Obama daughters, or to study at Beida or whatever. These are the sorts of things we really need to do. We need to stretch our minds by learning other languages and other cultures. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Cool. Thanks very much, Tonio. And that links up to John Richardson's point earlier, right, about the importance of neuroplasticity and the effects that come from language learning. So that's fantastic. Alan, what were your thoughts?
I think I'll just echo what Andrew and Tonio have said. Having listened to all the discussion, I would probably now take my paper, my comments in quite, well, maybe not entirely different direction, but certainly in qualified ways, especially in terms of language. And there is one other element which I didn't go into, and now I think is important to add. When you think about making soup, it's not just about the ingredients. It's also about the fire. It's also about the physical conditions. And I think that would add further complexity to this whole discussion. The distinction between wen and wu, civil and military, it's actually also a culinary term. You cook soup using wen, fire, and you cook other things using wu, fire. So these metaphors, I think, are very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks very much for that. Helena, I know you went last, so I won't ask you how you changed your talk, but did you adjust anything in the lead-up? During the day, as you heard some of the other material, were there things that you changed or certain nuances that evolved?
I also have learned a lot from the other speakers. When Professor Chen mentioned about Sapir-Whorf's hypothesis, I was very happy because I believe all philosophers are partly linguists, and so is Professor Chen. Thank you.
Yeah. No, great, thank you. And just in terms of the language issues that everyone's been talking about, I'm always struck by the fact that, when you watch some of those fantasy films, right, nearly all of them, whether it's Lord of the Rings or some of the newer ones, like the one with the dragons, right, I forget the name. Well, there's Game of Thrones, and then there's the other one with the young kid, Aragon. But it's all right, the name doesn't matter. But one thing that unites all of them, right, Ursula Le Guin's work on Earthsea as well, they all talk about how when you can name something, you control it. When you name something in what they call the old language, right, the language of the elves or the language of whatever deities that exist, you control it. And I think that's why language, as we've been talking about today, is so critical. Because when we name something, we understand it in ways that allow us, I think, to take action and make decisions based on them, which is partly why this discussion is such a critical one. Let's open this up now to questions from anyone on the floor. I'd like to see if we can take 2 or 3 at a time, and then we can have the panel respond. If you're directing this to a specific person on the panel, please let us know so that they also can get their thoughts ready. Ma'am? And then let's take George after that. Yeah.
On? Okay, thank you. So I'm a bit slow, so I didn't ask the question, Alan, when you were making the presentation. You said sort of in a passing remark, and I just want to pick it up again and have you explain it because I don't quite agree with what you said. You said that the ideological gap is actually narrowing. And I quite like your chicken soup metaphor, but I don't have the impression that in the world that we live in today, it's actually narrowing, because the ideological stance that a lot of people take is even stronger than before. So just to follow your chicken soup thing, right? There is now whether, what kind of chicken is it? Is it free range? Is it, kampong?
Yep.
Is it what, right?
Is it black? Is it white?
Then there is this halal. Is it halal chicken or not halal chicken? And oh, by the way, screw it all, I'm actually vegetarian. So it's not,
mock chicken as well, right?
It is not as, I think it's actually increasing because the ideological stance that ISIS can take by appealing to Muslims in Malaysia to say that you can actually come and join us. I mean, that is to me, that is a widening gap. It's not a gap that's actually narrowing. So I wondered, you just said it in one sentence and then you just went off, and I just thought, no, that's too easy.
All right, great. So something on ideological gap and chicken soup. George, you're giving a talk tomorrow on fusion food, right?
Yeah. That has nothing to do with cuisine. What I think that the world is watching the United States today, or until the 8th of November. And the big problem when we read, listen, or watch is that contrary to the preparatory meetings we had with Jan, where all of us had another native language, and we were all speaking in English, which made us, as Helena did show, different. I wouldn't say better, but we had an apprehension, a grab of the world, which was more complex. Now, the two people who are competing and who can destroy the planet at the push of a button, to my knowledge, at least one knows absolutely nothing about another language. And the other one has a superficial, not a visceral knowledge. John Kerry is totally fluent in French because he learned it very early. My question to you, and I thought about Helena first, but I think it's to everybody. How do you reconcile what you all said about the problems facing the world? Because of cultures, when you have somebody who has an embryonic culture who is going maybe to run the world, I think it's scary. And these are consequences for Singapore, because anything can happen here.
Fantastic. Two very easy questions so far. Nice to start us off. Anyone else? Otherwise, we can take those two first. Okay, why don't we take those two first? Alan, you want to go first on the ideological gap?
Just very quickly, my comment really was directed especially at contemporary Chinese culture, where you see very noticeable surge in consumerism, especially among the younger generation. It's no longer about any particular set of beliefs or values, but in that sense, the ideological gap, I was basically referring to that new ingredient that seems to be becoming more and more dominant in contemporary China.
Great. Okay, thanks. Helena, you want to take up George's challenge first, at least, on native languages and non-native languages? Because I think his thought was particularly for you. And then we can see if Andrew and Tonio have other thoughts they'd like to add.
Okay, we probably all agree, if you can speak a second language, we probably all agree that when you use your native language to express yourself, you feel confident and you can speak what is going on in your mind. But when you switch to a second language, you always have to think or try to use searching for lexicons or ways to express yourself. This is between native speakers and non-native speakers. But even the native speakers, when they speak, express themselves, they probably also follow certain kinds of, we call it thinking pattern, or Dan Slobin mentioned that thinking for speaking phenomenon. You have certain kinds of thoughts, but because your language constrains you and you only exemplified certain part of your thought. And George mentioned the current situation in the United States, is the president candidate. To the linguists, all those debates are very interesting. There are people who analyze their body language and the words they use, and then you can, in one way or another, understand what exactly this politician tries to convey. And that has already become part of the analysis for any kinds of political issues that are involved. So language is indeed important. Thank you.
Andrew, Tony, do you want to add anything to that?
Are
you afraid of Donald Trump?
I want to tackle George's question,
Great.
which is a really deep one. This we're seeing actually not a clash of civilizations, clash of cultures, but actually a clash of interests. You know, the old phrase, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And I think what has happened now is that there's a global shift from a unipolar situation into a multipolar situation. And that multipolar situation is particularly scary because, you know, China has moved completely beyond anybody's imagination. 35 years ago, you said that China would become world number 2. People would laugh at you, but it happened. So, you know, China has moved at such speed, you know, that to a large extent, the number 1 feels is not about American exceptionalism, it's about American insecurity. The world is not about security, it's about everybody's insecure now, right? And that creates a situation in which the clash of interests become very volatile. We have very recent experience of this issue from Cold War I, where it was a nuclear standoff. And everybody understood that the nuclear standoff was mutual destruction. But we are now no longer, if we look at this historical issue, no longer in that field because the situation has become very complex because of the Middle East. The lady over there talked about ISIS and the clash of, to some extent, religious beliefs. The clash with the demonizing, if I may use the word, of Russia, which creates also its own kind of tension. So we are now seeing a 3 to 4, 5 front clash of interest, whereby I think the scary part, in my view, is that if the military-industrial complex, which was President Eisenhower's term, pushes the envelope only for military solutions to the clash of interests, then we are doomed. Okay, we're doomed because we cannot find commonality. I was trying to think about the deep codes. You know, how do we find the areas of, common interest? And you can see this. The most recent success, I think, of the Obama administration is on climate change, right? India also signed up, China signed up on carbon emission issues, and this is great success. But on the area of kind of military, it is very scary. And it is scary in this sense. And this is not meant to be I favor one side or the other. If you watch National Geographic, you would know that when the elephant or the lion comes near you, you get very scared. Okay? Now, but when a little kitten comes near you, you don't get scared at all. Right? In fact, you say it's a great thing for the kitten. So basically what is happening is that when the 7th Fleet or whatever comes within the Chinese waters or near it, I'm not surprised that the Chinese get very nervous and worry about accidents and all these sort of issues. So to me, we're now moving into very complex, very murky waters of clash of interests, which goes to show that it is extremely important. The old African phrase, which is also Asian, is that when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled.
Yeah.
I like the other phrase, which is when elephants make love, grass also gets trampled. But
sometimes it's hard to tell the difference.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. So these are very complex issues, which we think we need to start thinking about. And even though this conference appears very distant from the foreign policy and the security issues, and even the trade issues, they are, at philosophical levels, is the one that we need to get engagement.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, tomorrow we'll hear from Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, who's a foreign policy practitioner. He's speaking on multiculturalism, so not quite the foreign policy type issues, but I'm sure he has thoughts on how some of the ramifications of what we're discussing today might have bearing on, say, the US-China relationship, not just on the South China Sea now, but on broader issues and how they manage that set of interactions. Let's take a new set of questions. Yeah. Rachel?
Thanks. This is a somewhat different question. There's an issue that I think that has gone in and out of our discussions today that I'd like to make explicit. It seems to me that one of the things that defines and complicates cultural identities is this working?
I think it's
Oh, okay, sorry. One of the things that defines and complicates cultural identities is aspects of language that are written, not just oral. To take one example, and I'm not trying to pick on any one group, I'm guessing that there are some people in this room who are ethnically Chinese who are Christian. And yet, does everyone in that category read the Older New Testament in Greek or Aramaic, let alone Latin? I'm guessing in most cases not. And so that identity is refracted through either reading the Bible in English or hearing versions of it through preaching or whatever. And so we have different webs of identities that come through our reception of the past and identification with it that don't necessarily correspond to obvious cultural identities. And it seems to me that this gap, if you like, between performed oral language and the reception of written language, whether from yesterday or from 2 millennia ago, is another part of this complex question, as if it weren't complex enough. So I'd be interested to hear people's views.
fantastic. So there's two sets of issues there, actually, right? The hyphenation of identities as well as the oral and written dichotomy and how we manage those. Fantastic. One more question? Yeah, Dr. Savage.
I'd like to address my question to Andrew. Am I correct? Yeah. I was just interested that, you know, your whole talk was about change, but something that was missing was what was the role of the famous Chinese book, the I Ching, the Book of Changes? Why did you not surface that in your particular presentation? So since your talk is about changes, is it not important? Is it important? So, you know, I thought that that sort of was an important sort of document in the way the Chinese see change, as it were, since they have a whole book on the I Ching. So that's my first part of the question. My second part of the question is that you said that Chinese thinking was holistic, contextual, mystical, and reflection. Well, that's okay in terms of theory, but on the ground, you know, all of us that have come from an education system in Singapore and Hong Kong and China and Japan, we know very well it's a very, very authoritarian system, right from the home. We listen to our parents. You're not allowed to give back chat or qualify what your father and mother says. It's the rule of the house, the law. You go to school, your teachers say this, and you're not allowed to question that as well. And same with the government, you know, anybody who falls out of step. In China, they do it. I mean, there's a lot of creativity in China. I mean, you know, Professor Cox talks about 5 particular websites that publish a whole lot of poems, stories, fictional things that they can't do in terms of publishing. So they publish it on the internet. And hundreds of thousands of Chinese read it. So you can see that, you know, while it's very good to say that we are reflexive, we are contextual, holistic, but the real situation on the ground is quite different. And it doesn't allow for creativity. Confucianism doesn't allow for creativity. And that's the order. You know, the distinction, I think, between West and East is that the East has a Confucianistic system of education, whereas the West has a Socratic system of education, which allows for this questioning. Obviously, you can look at Amartya Sen's work on, you know, the argumentative Indian, also include, because he's trying to include Indian philosophy and thought as a Western paradigm, not an Eastern paradigm, that there is this idea of, you know, questioning, etc. So I'd just like your thoughts on this.
Great, and maybe you want to start on that if you don't mind.
Wow.
Well,
What a question.
it is a huge question, but I think an important one, and that might allow us to segue back to the earlier question on, you know, identities written in oral traditions, as well as how we deal with hyphenation and multiple identities coexisting in a single person.
No, that's a wonderful question. I mean, that you know, I need to another, you know, 3 days to explain this. But in very simplistic terms, the change is the issue. But you know, they recognize right from the beginning that change is the deep code of Chinese philosophy, okay? That change is the only constant. But then in Chinese culture, given limited resources and bounded by the geography, stability is everything, okay? So that contradiction in itself, change within stability, 以稳求进, right? I mean, you know, you want to progress through stability, but can you? Because change happens through crisis to a large extent. And so there is this inherent contradiction that always exists. So we are all the products. I mean, you know, I don't know about you, but my generation has always been the product of highly disciplinarian, memorize this, you know, the kids today won't remember this, but I used to have my teacher take the, you know, the windows through a stick and take that stick and whack me if I couldn't remember, you know, the classics of whatever. But and that was a very fundamental way of teaching. And I want to explain this. Chinese culture, through its geography, has been always top-down. But in reality, it has always been 九合必分,九分必合. That means, you know, a centralization and then decentralization, you know, collapse and centralization again. So that they understand. But the authoritarianism comes from that Confucian idea that if you don't have discipline in the family, you don't have discipline in the community, you don't have discipline in the nation. That's the mantra of it. And how did Chinese deal with this? And it comes from the Kung Fu films. If you look at the Kung Fu stories, what happens to every Chinese? It actually deep code. The deep code, if you look at the Chinese Kung Fu family, is that the parents get killed and the child wants revenge. What does the child do? He looks inward himself. He goes up the mountain, learn the Kung Fu, and come down and conquer everybody. Okay? That is a very deep angst of Chinese philosophy. That 知己知彼, you need to understand it within yourself. So Chinese creativity works within that constraint. Look at Zhang Daqian. Zhang Daqian which is the greatest Chinese artist, he had to prove that he was better than the masters, okay, before he was allowed to create. He copied all the masters, right? And that is the way the Chinese feel is progress. You know, the masters is perfect, and therefore, in order to be creative, you are not allowed as an American child, day one, to question the masters. Who are you to question, you know, Kongzi, Shunzi, you know, all this. They know all this. They know all this before. No, you have to be the master of all this. You prove that you are the master, and then you say, I can do this because I'm the master already. I am Picasso because I've learned from Raphael, I've learned from all the big masters, and then I can create. So creativity within China has always been in this style. What has now changed, if you really look at Chinese culture today, is that the most creative in China is called sanzai. Sanzai, you know, 创新, right? Which means that they exactly at 水浒传, which is the water margin. What is the water margin? It's actually the marshes. The people who escape authority go down to become bandits, all right, in enclaves, and then conquer the rest of Chinese society. So Chinese creativity has always this, I hope this is not meant to be derogatory, but it's meant to be complimentary, Irish streak in them. You just don't like authority. And, but the system needs to impose for stability that authority. But that creativity comes manifests itself in very, very different forms. So I totally accept what you say, except that our generation now has learned from the West, learned that creativity is a different style, but by actually creating that openness, also you lose something, which is the loss of the memory, which is what I personally also regret, because I don't have good memory anymore. I just everything I go Google.
Actually, what you described is very powerful, because even in Journey to the West, right, the Monkey King both submits to and subverts authority at different points of the story, and that's necessary to move the narrative along.
Yeah, and just to supplement the monkey
You want
narrative,
to just grab the mic?
is that the Buddha said, he told the monk, you think you can fly 30,000 kilometers, and as you know, the monk pissed on the peak after he flew 30,000 kilometers, and then the monk put his palm out. Can you smell this?
Yeah.
And the monk said, you cannot run out of my hand, and that's Chinese authority.
Indeed. On that sobering note, let's hear some thoughts on
If I may,
hyphenation.
I'll
Please.
try to combine the two questions.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Yeah.
I really like Lisa's comment, and that's why I try not to look at languages as static systems or entities, and I particularly appreciate those scholars who talk about linguistic or communicative competence. That really tries to describe how human beings can receive and build on not only written language traditions, but also oral traditions and from multiple languages. And this competence would then allow us to manage complexities in different ways. And essentially, the soup analogy is really meant to suggest that every culture is trying to manage its own perceived set of complexities. And within that context, certain cultures, Chinese for example, in which hierarchy, authority may seem prominent, but it does not really eradicate or make creativity impossible, it seems to me. As Andrew has made it so clear, China is also the land of Li Bai. China is also the land of Du Fu. If you want to look at contemporary figures, China is also the land of Lu Xun, also the land of Ba Jing, and so on. But it does give the writing, the creativity, a certain texture, a certain feel to it. I think so long as we don't mistake that to be lack of creativity or anything, that particular distinct flavor and texture, of course, should be recognized.
Great. Helena, you look like you have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah. I also like Lisa's question, but I can give you some data about bilingual speakers in Singapore, the adults. I have been collecting data from bilingual speakers between age 25 to 35. Right now, I've got about 60 participants, and it's a large quantity of data. Where I used the social identity theory, personal identity theory, and create incomplete sentence questionnaire. Ask the participants to complete the sentences. And the sentence could start like I, and then you just write whatever you want. Or as a mother, and then you complete it. Or as a husband, you complete it. Or if a child starts to disobey, and then you complete a sentence. Or gay marriage is. So all these sensitive issues or different kinds of questions that can arouse you to answer based on your social ideology. And the result, I already analyzed about 20 participants' data in English and Chinese. So what I did is you can pick up whichever first, English or Chinese version. Once you finish the English version, you don't look at your English version. You then answer the questions in Chinese. So when, like I, being a woman, And then when you write in Chinese, and then you give something, write that. But when you answer it in English, and you write it based on what you are thinking at that moment. And the results show that more than half of them use the only differences lies in the lexicon choices. They use like gay marriage is not acceptable, but in Chinese they say 不可以、不道德的、罪恶的、危险的、可怕的。But in English they just write not acceptable, but they are not equivalent. But on a larger picture, you can see that the bilingual speakers in Singapore, they have the collectivist ideology. So the English language actually does not actually affect their ideology. And this refers to you reading the Bible through the websites of, oral communication rather than the native speakers of English living in the United States or Europe. So starting from childhood, understanding all these social values. So that's the current results. Thank you.
Fantastic. Tonio, any thoughts? No? Okay, sorry. All right. Can I just see if there's anyone else? Actually, no, you haven't had a chance this round, have you? So yeah, go for it, John. That was the earlier question. So. No, go for it. Yeah, you want the mic.
So there's a form of discourse that hasn't been much discussed, but I think those of us who work with students are very conscious of it, and it's the discourse of the smartphone. So when I got on the elevator to go up to my apartment in my residential college, students are mostly checking their smartphone. And Sherry Turkles at MIT has reported that students that on average access their smartphones 200 times a day, which is like 400 minutes a day. So this is an element of discourse, certainly, that is shaping younger generations. And I'd just be interested in the panel's perception of this and how that factors into the kinds of things we've been discussing.
Let me just throw something on top of that before we take one more question. Because, I mean, what you raised, John, also links to something I've been mulling on for the whole day, which is the terms East and West are very, very territorial terms, right? They're defined, at least initially, by physical space, and then they ramify into things like language and culture and things like that. But we're moving now into a world that is increasingly digital. So once that space is more or less the dominant space, or one of the dominant spaces where interaction happens, then are concepts like East and West actually meaningful or not, apart from in a residual way because we happen to have languages that are different. So if the panel can comment on some of that, I think that would be very, very useful. One more question? Great.
I'd like to address this question to Dr. Gao about her speech. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the impression that I sort of got from the earlier part of your presentation was that a language like English doesn't have the same sort of meaning encoding power as a language like Mandarin, in the sense that Mandarin has these very apparent threads of commonality, like the 女字旁, that sort of encodes this meaning of like a female character. From my understanding of it as sort of someone who's very interested in linguistics myself, I find that English, to my understanding, is a lot more of a bastardized language than Mandarin, for example, because we have sort of influences from, like the example that you gave of like sister, mother, aunt, they are very inconsistent. It's because sister and mother come from Proto-Germanic, while aunt comes from Old French, for example. So because of this sort of bastardized like English versus the kind of more linear progression that Mandarin has taken as language, do you think that it's a fair assessment to sort of compare these two directly?
Thank you for your question. Indeed, personally, I believe this part of the differences between English and Chinese affect our understanding of the human relations. Taking this, female semantic radical, whenever you talk about these females or males, like when you learn these characters in Chinese, your teachers always tell you this refers to female, and then hand refers to something you perform the action, the radical hand. And then you always know that this is related to hand or food. This has become part of the education, even to the native speakers of Chinese at an early age. And kinship terms is one of the, in Chinese, probably is one of the largest fundamental system in a language that reflects how the social structure is formed in a society. So indeed, to me, I think that plays a role. Thank you.
Great. Helena, since you've got the mic, do you want to maybe make our first response to John's question as well, on the digital space and smartphones in particular?
Oh, this has become an interesting discussion and a research topic among the linguists. People tend to check, like every year my students taking social linguistic classes, they want to have a project on how people use this language using WeChat or Skype or whatever, and then they analyze how they jump the subjects and use the verbs and how they make the connections between this and that. And indeed, we find changes. And people tend to use the language casually, much more casually than before. And people seem to have, to me, more cognitive loads in communication than before, because you tend to communicate with people simultaneously at the same time with several people, and then you make the links. So this, in fact, affect not only the use of language, but also our cognitive and perceptive abilities. And that's why my last question in my talk is that could this be involved with history? Thank you.
Great. Alan, should we just go in reverse order? Yeah.
I bet 20% of the 200 minutes, what did you say, that our students are spending on their phone?
200 times, I think
200
is what you
times.
said, yeah.
20% of that would be spent on trying to catch Pokemon. And Pokemon actually is an interesting phenomenon because it has a religious background to it. Pocket monsters. What are these monsters? They actually relate to traditional Taoist sense of catching demons who can then be trained and served your interest. So I think there is, in one sense, a super highway, if you like, where cultural elements, communication can be expedited and shared much more effectively with the development of digital and social media. But I also want to say that it is a double-edged sword, because in a moment, nationalistic fervor can be fanned, and things can get out of control a lot more quickly, if you like.
There are pocket monsters in other traditions as well. The jinn are often known in Islam to be creatures you can control, and then that's how you get magicians as well. So that kind of blurs the boundaries again, I think. Tonio?
I mean, I think having little personal computers that, we carry around that are as powerful as supercomputers were 20 years ago is certainly changing everything. And I think actually reducing the barriers to communication, translation software is getting better, and I don't know, it seems to me very difficult, having learned languages, to imagine that computers will ever really be able to really translate the kind of nuances and everything that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But it's certainly getting better and better. But one of the things I think that's kind of fascinating about cell phones is that you could take a picture. So it's not all just like texting. You can take a picture of something, of your whatever perspective you have at the moment, and you can send that. And I was reading something about dolphins. And people are trying to understand, it's pretty clear that dolphins have some kind of ability to communicate linguistically. And it seems possible, some people theorize that dolphins and cetaceans in general who communicate through sonar, they might be able to send pictures to each other by mimicking the sounds that reflected things make. So they just send, hey, look, like it's sort of like a cell phone, like, you know, look at that fish over there or whatever. But anyway, I think maybe we're becoming more like dolphins with our cell phones.
That's a new one. Okay. That could be another conference as well. Yeah.
I thought the question was very good. What we have now begun to slowly appreciate is that crowd behavior is very different from individual behavior, right? And that the older way of thinking, you just compare and contrast this. I don't like to use the word shallow, but it's really instant. I mean, anything that happens on your smartphone is now instant, right? You know, you do it on WeChat or you do it on WhatsApp, you know, it instantly goes out. I mean, Pokemon is like that. You can reach not out just to 50, you can go out to 50,000, you can go to 500,000, it can go viral very, very fast. That, and it's two ways, because you're either receiving the information or you're sending it. Compare and contrast this to the guru in India, who actually goes up the mountain, or the Chinese guru who goes up the mountain and spends the 40 years to contemplate one issue. Okay, I mean, it's more or less timeless, and you know the issues are very different. So one is a crowd wiki wisdom, as it were, and the other one is the self, you know, contemplation, meditation, whatever you call it, and it's very different. It's very different. You just think about this in this context, and I just want to use Chinese history to demonstrate this. The Chinese went to, which were basically using Chinese, went to India, learned Sanskrit, which is, I'm sorry to say, mindless words. Anybody who learns Buddhism in Chinese would realize a lot of the sounds are actually Chinese wording of Sanskrit. Sanskrit is actually extremely eloquent language, and in tonal words. And then the Chinese internalized the philosophy of Buddhism using very complex language translations. And this was done not by one generation, but over a number of generations, right? So this translation that went on demonstrate that with very different languages, very different concepts, actually, you know, cultures translate, but not immediately. And so what we're now witnessing is the young learning very, very fast. Now, machine codes, okay? And through this new language, they're looking at the world very differently and, you know, changing the way we think about. But again, amongst that young, some of you are going up mountains. I mean, you know, you call that mountain Silicon Valley or something like that. But they are thinking very, very differently. And that's what is causing that change.
I mean, one of the questions we haven't answered from today actually is, what exactly does west of east and east of west look like, right? Is it a merger, or is it some creation of a new, of a hybrid, which several of you mentioned earlier? Or you know, is there something completely different that we end up producing with its own deep codes that doesn't actually look like either of the other two, but is the result of some kind of interaction, but not necessarily mixing? I don't know if we've got to that yet, but that may be something that ends up getting taken as a theme, you know, over tomorrow or even Wednesday's discussions. Let's take another round of questions. Yes. Lady at the back. Yeah.
Really interesting topic. I have a question because a lot of you on the panel are educators, and Singapore is a fantastic place. And I find it interesting that in Singapore, you know, most people are bilingual here, so you have a different culture, and then you're more, I guess, compared to the other parts of Asia, the Singapore has a lot of more diversity here, and then and a stronger, I guess, international exposure. However, I do feel that, you know, coming from the States, you do see that Asian students lose out in the job market. And not because people are not competent and not because people are not knowledgeable or smart, simply because is an interesting issue, like Helena said, is it is a linguistic thing, it is a cultural thing, and it is basically, in short, is because due to the culture and the fact that whether it's native language or not, Asians have difficulty in presenting themselves better in the job market. And that, but unfortunately, we're in a global job market where Asians are competing with Americans or Europeans or, all over the world. And so personally, I actually work in higher education, that you see a lot of that where people become very frustrated because they feel that they're not getting a fair play on the same platform. So I was wondering, from your perspective, how could universities in Singapore help students adapt to prepare them better for this increasingly competitive and globalized job market, which eventually, we're all going to compete in?
Cool, thank you. Yes.
I want to direct this question to Professor Andrew Sheng. You have mentioned that Chinese pragmatic approach has achieved fast growth, but also lack value-based framework. That's because what you say is serious interests against some values, which is why the youngs are not believe in values. That one I agree with, as we can see that there's a reduction in integrity, honesty, these kind of values in China as those high-end corrupted officials. But that is also, I think that is also because of the influence from the West, that the market economy, those kind of things, that everybody is more focusing on their own self-interests. Can you hear?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to ask that what can Chinese do to help ourselves, as the influence from the West are certainly not going to stop so long the internet still exists?
Okay. Why don't we take the first one first, with the question on the job market, right? And how, particularly as educators and people in institutes of higher education, you think you can help your students best to deal with this. Of course, that presumes you agree with the premise. I suppose if you want to push back on that, that's possible. So, Tonio?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I notice, because at my university we have a lot of overseas students, a lot of Chinese and Koreans. And I think one of the things that American instructors often do is have presentations that are required, right? And so presenting, public speaking, and I know that's done here as well, is something that is emphasized from quite early on in American education. And I find that Chinese students and Korean students tend to be a little more reserved when they start out, but by the end of the semester, they are presenting themselves sort of much more kind of confidently and using I and talking, so I think public speaking is a great focus for training, not just writing, not just test taking, but the public speaking is very important.
And building up that muscle, right, as you go along. Yeah. Alan?
I agree completely with Tonio. I mean, institutionally, of course, you can address this issue in different ways. You look at your curriculum, see if there's room to broaden your curriculum even further. You can also look at ways to encourage more international exposure through student exchange. You want to review regularly your pedagogy to see whether there's room to have a more interactive style of learning. But you're also right in the sense that this is not a university matter, because the education system starts from primary school. And there is still, I would argue, a very strong emphasis on examinations, not only in Singapore, but in many Asian countries. But that is something that these countries are looking into. In Singapore, at least, there is already a pilot, a scheme in place where for the first couple of years, no more homework, a lot more show and tell. But of course, you also have to be mindful that while a student may be very good at presenting things, there must also be intellectual substance. He or she must also still have something meaningful to say. Yeah.
You want to add anything, Helena? Any thoughts?
Just to add to what Professor Chen just mentioned, according to my experience of teaching here for 10 years, I can see that the difference between the American or the North American, I taught in Canada for 4 years, and I see the difference. Like the Singaporean students, just like what Andrew mentioned, they follow their teachers, like their masters. And whenever they conduct a performance or do assignment, they want to make sure this is exactly what the teacher asked them to do. And if I see, it happened to me a few times, when I see a very smart student who just mentioned some interesting ideas, and I said, what about you just work on this as assignment? And then other people will say, well, then you have to treat us equally. So if you give assignment to the class, then it has to be all the same. You cannot give assignment to a particular student. And so this is a way of mental set. So I follow my master, or who is my supervisor or my teacher for the course, and then they want to do exactly what the teachers require. Maybe this is kind of a constraint on the creativity or presenting themselves. They are very careful, maybe for the purpose of getting high scores, forgetting that actually is a way of training you to develop your abilities to be independent. Take Sapir and Wolf. Wolf was just an engineer, but he became interested in linguistics. He could follow a professor at Yale and to develop his interests. Could such thing happen at university in Singapore or in China? This is a question that sometimes I ask myself. Thank you.
Helena, thanks. Andrew, maybe both those sets of questions then?
Well, you know, I think I'll concentrate on the very good question for the young, which is, why is there this values vacuity, you know, this vacuum in values today? And the answer is that the world today is, to a large extent, a celebration of self. You know, why do we take so many selfies? Because we want to look and admire ourselves. And why is the latest WeChat, the software, can not only take the selfie, but actually improve my skin color, you know, different glasses and everything. You know, we have a very different value system today.
Immediately edit.
Okay? You know, it's universal now. But that self over everything destabilizes society, because I can have everything ahead of everybody else. And this is where Chinese philosophy, Chinese values, in the traditional sense, is lost. It does not know how to handle this. Okay? You know, in the old days, you could say, my generation, as I said, the father says, father is right, mother is right, shut up. You know, I mean, just get on with it, all right? Mom and dad tells you to go and to become a lawyer, accountant. That's God's truth. Today, Dad, I want to be a chef. Okay? And it's not wrong, it's absolutely right. Today, you know, the chef and the startup can be very, very good. Where that value system has gone wrong is that today, and this is not just China, I mean, this is not just China. This is worldwide, right? You know, we all know it does not pay to steal 2,000, because you can go to jail and you can get shot for it. You know, you steal $1 billion and you laugh all the way to the bank. And it's open. I mean, that's the tragedy of it all, right? This crisis has demonstrated this, which is why the whole population is extremely angry. At least, I mean, you know, the Silicon Valley is basically saying, well, you know, if you create a great idea, you can be a billionaire. You don't have, you know, to rob a bank, right? Put it this way. So the values of the 21st century cannot be judged by the glasses and the mindsets of the 19th and the 20th century. That's our problem. We lack a philosophy and a value system for the 21st century that is stable. And at the present moment, there are no such philosophies. And part of it, I am sorry to say this, is that our thinkers, okay, irrespective of professions, have become so narrow that we are not able to give this, and therefore some of us turn to religion. And that religion has also its byproducts, which are very difficult to resolve.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. Let's take one last round of either 2 or 3 questions. Great. Let's do the lady over there, and then Leon, and then you can go and have the last word.
Hi. Okay. I'd just like to ask, catching on the idea of how we have not really clarified east of west and west of east, like what really forms this space. And there has been a lot of discussion on east and west, but I'd like to ask, are we really coming from a lens that is rather objective? Because in saying east and west, there is a centrality that this terminology comes from. So like east of where and west of where? Like where does this central point of perspective come from? And I'd also like to ask, do you feel that by discussing about east and west, there's actually a rather like political, ideological underlinings behind it? And so in using this to understand culture and the differences in culture, is there actually sort of a mismatch of definitions and perspectives there?
Great. It's a fantastic question. Leon?
So I have several observations and questions that will flow from that.
Okay.
First, it seems, and this is mostly directed to Andrew, I think. You seem to be presenting culture as something that is, very, very coherent, right? There's been very little discussion generally of conflict within cultures. So, I mean, would most Chinese in the world agree with your characterization of Chineseness? Do your characterizations apply to the Chinese diaspora, for instance? How about the Chinese in Singapore, Malaysia? What do you have to say about that? Also, it seems to me that culture has generally been presented as something very static. Have the Chinese always thought of their history and culture in the way they do today? Have they interpreted the history in the same ways? If not, briefly and broadly, it'd be nice if any of you could trace the changes in this self-conception. And finally, this conference was supposed to be about East and West, but we've really spoken very little about the West. We assume we understand the West so well. I don't know how true that is, though. Thanks.
Okay. More provocations there. And one last question, I think.
Hi. My question is, how relevant is the distinction between the East and the West in the 21st century, given that when compared to the intergenerational divide, that of, for instance, the old guard being resistant to change and enforcing tradition, both East and West, compared to the young, which are yearning for change and desire to break free from tradition. So if that's the case, how relevant then we're trying to split between the East and the West when it's really between the old and the young?
I don't know where these questions all suddenly appeared from, right? But they're very strong, interesting, deep philosophical questions for us, that go right to the heart of the theme, and which I think are a great way to end, actually, because we will then segue into tomorrow's discussions. I'll ask the panelists to just respond to these broadly, and then I'll give you one other chance after that to just make some quick final remarks in response to a very broad question that I will pose to all of you. But let's take these first, right? All dealing with what exactly East is, what is West, what do we do about conflict within cultures, what do we do about evolution dynamically within a culture, and what exactly is the West? And I see Tonio wants to
Yeah, I'm so glad you
Yeah.
raised this question, the gentleman to the left here. It's something that I did want to talk about in my talk. When we talk about Eastern culture and Western culture, and again, we have to use kind of scare quotes around these, we're talking about tremendously deep, tremendously complex cultural systems that contain within themselves all kind of contradictions and conflicts, and they're not static, as you said. They're constantly evolving, constantly changing. And I think there are, in fact, resources within each culture, so much as you can even define them as separate cultures, to kind of apprehend the things that may appear incommensurable. For example, the Taoist conceptions of change at the base of the Tao Te Ching and the I Ching and everything. I mean, there's Western philosophers that have said very similar things. Heraclitus, for example, who talked about you never step in the same river twice, and the mystical tradition in the medieval period in the West. I mean, yeah, we're making it seem monolithic, almost in each case, I think, but these traditions are so rich and so deep that the more we dive into them, the more we realize that they contain worlds, you know? So I'm really glad that you raised that question.
Would anyone like to go next? Alan?
Oh, I completely agree again with Tonio's description. That's why I think we really need to have thicker description of individual cultures before we try to hastily compare them. East, West, of course, these are only convenient labels. But I do want to come back to one point raised earlier. I think, Andrew, you would be interested in this in particular. Do you think Chinese culture is still influenced by ancestor worship? I attended a talk recently that is very, very interesting. You try to translate it for me, okay? In the past, we pay homage to, we worship, well, not worship like perhaps, but definitely is the Lao Tzu Zong that is important, that dictates many things that's happening in our own lives. Now, it's the Xiao Zu Zong that really is identifying the value, the meaning in the lives of the parents and also the grandparents. And this is addressing the point about intergenerational gap. So even at that level, things are changing very rapidly.
Yeah.
Well, you didn't translate it for me, so I have to translate it for myself. In the past, it's your previous ancestors that seem to be the authoritative, the main focus of one's existence. Now, every attention is given to the one child. From the grandparents, the parents' lives revolve around that little ancestor.
I can just contribute some of my personal experience. In the early 90s, when I was in Sweden, I came across an article written by a Spanish speaker who lived in and who conducted a study. A group of researchers conducted a study collecting data of speech acts among these Europeans. And they made a conclusion that if you are bilingual, you are naturally a bicultural person. And when I saw that, I was surprised. And I said, I had been learning English for many years, but I could hardly say that I knew anything about British culture or English culture. So then I conducted a study on collecting data on speech act or request, making a request. The Chinese people always use different kinds of using simply 请帮我做什么好吗? 请. But in English you have this could you please, can you please, would you please, would you mind? And in Singapore, even today, you can hear many people responded to would you mind by saying yes. Like, would you mind opening the door for me? And
yes,
they say, yes. And then you got confused. So this language culture and the language structure and the culture elements sometimes they integrated, but sometimes they are separated. So even though how well you speak a second language doesn't mean that you are bicultural. So East and West is really too big, a huge, question. Maybe we need to have many conferences like this and to explore. Thank you.
Thanks. Andrew?
Thank you. Well, I think it's fantastic that this afternoon, after a whole day, we come up with some fabulous questions. I think to answer Professor Chan's question, is there ancestor worship? I was hoping that you were going to talk on Chinese religion, because this is a real issue. It's not about religion, it's about, it's not worship, it's actually reverence, okay?
Veneration.
And it goes to show how the power of belief, rightly or wrongly, changes the destiny of even China. You know, the one-child policy, which was hugely disputed, was started by one demographer who believed that China cannot sustain the whatever population. And today, not just about one child, what you call one ancestor. When that one child dies, that lineage dies with him or her, right, as you know. And the whole language is lost. Where is Jiu Jiu? You know, where is, you know, you have only one word, auntie, but the Chinese have different for mother's side, father's side, third uncle, fourth uncle, all this, the whole vocabulary dies with the one-child policy. So I thought there were three questions, and I think they were all excellent. Let me, you know, moving on to the next one, which is about the diaspora. 15 years ago, let me say this with absolute confidence, I could meet what appears to be an ethnic Han, okay, I'm not even talking about Chinese, just possibly Han person, and I could identify with almost certainty, just by talking very quickly, the way they dress, behavior, from Taiwan, from Singapore, from Malaysia, from Thailand, from Indonesia, American-born Chinese, Australian-born Chinese, English-born Chinese. No problem. Today, I can't. That's how fast change has become. So, you know, the context has changed, you know, through all this, so we have a serious problem there. On this whole question of our East-West issue, I think the person raised this absolutely, that's why this conference was all about. And the best summary of this East-West issue, in fact, it's a deeper issue, is Premier Zhu Rongji, former Premier Zhu Rongji, who had this maxim that 屁股推脑袋, what I call the bum theory. That is your bum which pushes your brain. And your point of view depends on where you sit. Right? So now if you sit in the East, you look at the West, you have a view about the West. And when you look at the West, you look at the East, you know, you have a different view of the East. And that's why it's not objective. In fact, the whole scientific paradigm is that there is such a thing as objectivity. And Heisenberg principle has told you that the observed is being changed by the observer, and the observer is being changed by the observed. So, and that is, Heisenberg principle is fundamentally I Ching. So that's the whole purpose of this conference. We actually have now reached this period of global uncertainty whereby my behavior affects you and your behavior affects me. And irrespective, we just use the terminology, the label East or West. And we didn't, you know, Jean and I didn't know how to do it, so we put East of West, West of East, because it's actually elliptical. And so I think it is arising from this understanding that we need to, you know, understand you and you need to understand me, that eventually we will arrive at some kind of peaceful transition to a new world. I mean, that is the hope of this conference. So I think it's achieved it. I mean, you know, you get asking the right questions.
Great. The last set of questions in particular actually lead to an interesting place, because all of you, in different ways, either in your presentation or during this Q&A session, right, this panel, you all talked about the new world that we need to envision, right, where this old distinction of East and West, which, as many people have pointed out, has all sorts of intellectual and philosophical deficiencies, gets replaced. And the question, of course, is then what are we replacing it with? Right? What is the new label? What is the thicker description, to use your term, Alan? What is the new philosophy and value system? And it strikes me that we need two sets of newness here. We need new ways of thinking, first of all, new ontologies and new epistemologies. And there are some beginnings of answers to this, right? Quantum theory, complexity science, which a few of you referred to, global history that Tonio mentioned, which has links to complex adaptive systems as well. Those all point at new ways of thinking that don't get captured by the shackles of Eastern or Western thought, but allow us to hopefully at least breach new ground. But there's also new forms of action that we need to take, right? So not just new thinking, but new ways of acting. And some of this applies to the policy areas that you mentioned in your talk, Andrew: climate change, disruptive technology, how we get to more collaborative and agile bureaucracies, but also the digital space that I mentioned earlier. And I think here what we're inching towards is the fact that there are still going to be interests and nations and cultures and language, but we need to find ways, despite all of those things, or on top of them, to collaborate, cooperate, connect, and come to things with a orientation of curiosity. So the question I have for you is quite a big one, but if you can give us at least some tentative answers, I think these would be useful. What does this new world look like for you, right? Whether it's new thinking or new acting or a bit of both, how would you summarize this? Yeah. I mean, I think that would be a nice place to end, because it takes us very nicely into tomorrow's discussions also about how we look at the present in different policy areas: healthcare, cuisine, ambiguity, multiculturalism, and I think we will be quite nicely set up that way. So I suspect you might need a bit of time to think, so I'll ramble a little bit on for now, and then see if any of you wants to volunteer to start this discussion. We don't have to do it in any particular order. Tonio, great.
This is a good question, and it actually gives me a chance to respond to the question that the young man asked here at the second table here, which I thought was a really good question, and none of us got a chance really to answer it in the last round. You asked, why are we focusing so much on East versus West when really there's all these other sort of places of misunderstanding, like young versus old, for example. I, as someone more on the old category, I don't know how to answer it. Actually, I'd be very curious to hear your perspectives. But one thing that does seem clear is we are in an era of convergence in certain ways. I mean, there's a lot of barriers that we've talked about, but one area of convergence is the triumph of capitalism, of consumer capitalism. Really, we're pretty much in most places around the world, including mainland China, which is ostensibly socialist, things look very similar. And this is something, it's not clear that that's going to make the world a better place necessarily, although it's improving the lives of a lot of people, I guess you could say. But this I think we have to look at the sort of social and economic changes that are happening around the world for everyone, as we talk about the future. And what will that future look like, to get to Aaron's question? I hope that we're going to be learning a lot of each other's languages, continuing to travel, whether virtually or really, watching each other's television programs and movies and things like that. In a way, maybe it will look a lot like Singapore. If America could, just to name my own country, could be much more bilingual and have education systems that kind of take learning about other cultures more seriously, I think that the world would be a better place, and maybe if America still exists in 2050 or so, maybe we'd have better presidential candidates who actually know more about the world.
And the first step for that can be taken in a few weeks' time, right? We're all watching on tenterhooks. Alan?
One thing I really like about complexity science is that it teaches me that complex systems are not linear. So if you are talking about future, then I think we should be thinking of that in non-linear dynamic terms, which is to say we have to pay a lot more attention to how changing one element would affect the operations, the workings of the whole. And that would really require us to be a lot more careful, not rushing to judgments, and trying to understand how, what's that Chinese expression? You move one hair and it affects the whole body. 牵一发动全身. And I think that probably should be something we should keep in mind as we contemplate the interaction of cultures in the future.
Great. Helena?
I think nowadays the world is changing much, much faster than before. And today we talk about the differences between East and West. Maybe after a couple of years, and then you find a new trend of thinking, understanding, and behavior differences. So maybe this change, looking at it more in a positive way, it helps us to have more awareness of our surroundings and more understanding of the dynamics of the human beings in this world. So all these are interesting, I think. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Andrew? Yeah. We get you the last word.
I've said too much, so I'm just going to make an advertisement. I think, Aaron, you mentioned tomorrow we're going to have, food and neuroscience and all that. Yeah. But I think we especially brought De Kai in from Hong Kong, who is working on music. And I think that the music will be the bridge. It's not just food, but music will be the bridge. And so I hope a lot of you will stay for tomorrow night's dinner, where De Kai and his team, who especially flew in to entertain you, and hopefully through that we can bridge the fusion between East and West. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, all four of you. I won't even attempt to summarize any of that because that is not going to be possible. I will just say that one of the things that I'm continually struck by is a line from the novelist William Gibson, where he says that the future is actually already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think, as many of you pointed out, we're already starting to do things that take us to this newer world that we would like to get to. And I'm glad that we've at least started the discussion about what we need to keep doing and sustain so that we maintain that momentum on that path. And I know that being here at the conference and getting questions from all of you was certainly a very key part of that. So thank you, everyone in the audience, for the very, very active questioning and participation as well. Thanks.